Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I'm doing great, thank you very much. Go and get yourself that beautiful drink, whether it's hot or cold, because I've got an amazing story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, this fantastical, unprecedented story that I am about to share with you and your listeners, I am almost certain you will believe is far-fetched, incongruous, and beyond belief. But sometimes the most extraordinary things in life indeed are unambiguously true. If my incredulous story is anything, it is prodigiously extraordinary. I am in no doubt that you will listen to it and think, surely this cannot be. I do not concern myself with those of you that may have irresolute reservations or umbrage in regards to my stupendous arresting account. As at my advanced age, I sincerely do not care about those kind of things at all, such as vacillating skepticism or dubious unbelief, for it is of no consequence to me whatsoever if you believe my implausible story or not. But I will tell you this, it is unequivocally true. When I was a little girl, those kind of things mattered to me an awful lot. I hated it when my parents' immediate compunction would be to doubt my integrity, or to blatantly dismiss what I had to say out of hand. But then, all things considered, maybe this was because my parents lacked integrity. How could they then, in every regard, believe others possessed what they so clearly lacked? It's like someone who's inclined to pilferage. Such a person finds it difficult to believe that others do not do exactly the same thing as they do, for their behaviour makes perfect sense to them. It would seem age has a wonderful way of removing those stifling, oppressive inhibitions that youth can confiscate from us all too easily. You get to a place in your life where what others think of you is inconsequential, exiguous and negligible. You also find that the things you sought after so much in your former young life, like money and material gain, no longer hold as much of a bewitching allure for you as they did when you were younger. Of course, we all need money. I don't dispute that for a second, but I am content with having more than enough, for excess is of no real significance to me. As you get older, it feels great to downsize, to let go of all the accumulated stuff that formerly cluttered your life, was all-consuming, the relentless drive and pursuit for more and more, that is frecklessly meaningless. Personally, for me, this is exceedingly liberating. It's rather like being trapped in a cocoon, inhibited by the silk that incarcerates you. But once you squeeze your way out, you stretch your wings and fly. You're released from the shackles of your former temptations that once held you in bondage. Truly, I never thought I would share my idiosyncratic story with anyone, as this is the story I thought I would take to the grave with me, as it is so profoundly personal. It's quite simply a beautiful love story that deserves to be told. A story of forbidden, unlikely love between a young woman and an adoring hairy man known as a Bigfoot, who was in every respect as human as you or me. I was a 17-year-old teenager at the time of this story. It was the 50s. Those are the years of my life I remember the most vividly. As many of my memories beyond the age of 13, I regret to say, are more hazy, blurred, foggy and obscure. I wish I could say I had a happy childhood, but that was inordinately not the case, although I would not describe it as unhappy either. My insouciant parents were like hippies. They were carefree, unenterprising, frivolous, and always detached towards their own children. They smoked weed continuously. They took drugs and consumed a plethora of alcohol. Luckily, my parents never developed into nasty drunkards, as is often the case with people who overindulge in the excesses of alcohol. Even though it was the 50s, it was more like the swinging 60s had arrived in our home, a decade too soon. I was used to walking over a sea of bodies in our living room on a regular basis, rather like the airport lounges in Dubai, when you trail your luggage across carpets of people sleeping everywhere, awaiting for connecting flights. For indeed, beyond question, our cosy living room would look like an unsightly spectacle, as my parents, along with a few of their drunken, like-minded friends, would be dossing on the floor. Invariably dirty dishes were strewn all over the place, along with empty bottles of beer or spirits tossed haphazardly over surfaces, while the skunk smell of cannabis, with its notes of lemongrass, pine, fire and wood, impregnated the air with a cloying stench that was not always pleasant to my young nose. It was a potent smell that embodied itself in the walls, the carpets, the curtains and bed linen in our home. When I was at school, my school clothes stank of weed. It almost landed me in a heap of trouble with the principal of our school, but thankfully I assured her that my father was the guilty party. She thankfully chose to overlook it. I would often glide through the living room, like an aggrieved parent, cleaning up after a bunch of spoilt, petulant brats, with a bin liner in my hand, as I would pick up the mess after my parents. My parents would lie there fast asleep on the couch, oblivious to anything that was going on. I would throw away the beer and empty bottles. I would busy myself washing dishes, doing laundry, and often cooking, so I soon learnt to be self-sufficient and independent. My parents even sent me off on a cookery course so that I could cook for them should the need arise, as often they were too wasted to be able to take out a pan and pot. I never minded doing the cooking, for I had acquired a very useful skill. It seemed like the roles in our household were reversed, as my brother and I quite literally took on the parental roles, which is quite bizarre, but that is exactly what happened. I wish I was joking, but I'm absolutely not. Believe me, you'll be surprised about the clandestine secrets that occur behind closed doors of many people's lives, for sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. There were times there would be no food in the house, if my parents were too legless and half-cut to go grocery shopping, so my brother and I would fill up the fridge, order groceries to be delivered to our home by the grocer. He was a very nice man called Brian Fairweather, who owned a grocer's shop in town. I always remember he delivered the stuff we ordered on the telephone by bicycle with a basket. We had an ongoing account with him that we paid funds into every month like clockwork. Suffice to say, I didn't grow up in an impoverished lifestyle, as my affluent parents were exceedingly privileged. They had money, and lots of it. Maybe that was the quintessential problem. Do they not say the devil makes work for idle hands? No truer word was ever spoken. My father had inherited a sizable fortune from his dad, who had died prematurely, so he didn't need to work, and neither one of my parents ever lifted a finger a day in their lives, which was an awful pity. It may have redeemed their lives, given them a purpose to strive for. My parents, who should have been responsible adults, taking care of me and my brother, had very little interest in us at all. In a way, we were surplus to requirements. The unfortunate mistake that occurred by a random licentious act of nature that just was. I am heartily grateful that my mother was way too slothful to get an abortion, for it was possibly an inconvenience she could well do without. My parents were swept away by the beguiling attraction of a me, myself and I attitude, so they cared little about our coming and goings. So consequently in our young lives there were no rules. They were not the kind of parents that would visit our school for parents' evening to find out how we were progressing in our studies, or interested enough to watch you taking part in the school sports day. They weren't inspired by the tedious monotony of daily life, for they lived in an altered state of reality, under the influences of drugs, with the inevitable highs and lows of being intoxicated. I think no one ever found out about my parents' encumbrances, as they were masterfully masked by the money that covered the costs of our schooling and everyday requirements. So naturally the authorities or social services never suspected that two young children were growing up in a neglected environment, as all our most essential needs were provided, apart from the love and validation we so ravenously craved. Furthermore, me and my brother never breathed a word to a living soul outside of our family about our lives, for the last thing we wanted was to end up caught up in the labyrinth of social services. I knew that my childhood was not conventionally normal. I'd stayed over at my friends' parents' houses on multiple occasions. I was eyewitness to the mechanics and workings of a routine daily life. How I envied the ordered structure of their lives, the boundaries put into place by their parents, who ensured they were in bed by 8, and would ground you if you stepped out of line. Of course, my friends would groan tirelessly, complaining incessantly about how unreasonably unfair their parents were being, while I secretly envied them, as with all my heart, how I wished that my parents would actually give a damn. None of that happened in my household. My parents just did not care. They were not parents who beat me up or shouted obscenities or became irate, for they weren't abusive in that way. On the contrary, they were actually quite likeable people, but their main crime was neglect. I could stay over at a friend's house for a couple of weeks. My parents wouldn't bat an eyelid. With Eisenhower in power, prosperity flooded over America. People's lives were transformed as the economy was booming. Consequently, it was a great time to be alive. People were very happy, enjoying the benefits of a bountiful life after the ravages of the Second World War. Growing up, my family lived in a stunning 2-story granite beach house that was painted a grey-blue with colonial influences to the home, like the white pediments and balconies on the upper and lower elevations of our house, along with large white square windows that overlooked magnificent ocean views. Our house was nestled on a large square of sumptuous bright green turf that graced the top of a high rocky incline on the Oregon coast. It was in a remote spot on the edge of the peninsula. You could be forgiven for thinking there were no houses around for many miles, but there was one obscure home further along the coast on the right, and then the houses would scatter more frequently until they fed their way towards the local town. People barely ever walked as far down the coast where our house was situated. It was infinitely more rustic where we were, with huge pieces of driftwood, mounds of seaweed, and large shells washing over to the shore daily. Ostensibly, there was a long line of wrought-iron steps that seamlessly spiralled their way from the sumptuous turf of our front yard down the rocky incline towards the glorious soft white sea sand and the blue ocean, which all belonged to us. It was our private beach. Fortunately, our home was protected by the wind by a plethora of trees, such as towering maples, red alders, cedars, crab apples and spruces. As it did get quite windy from time to time, but the summer temperatures were always pleasant, in the 60s or 70 degrees, which was comfortable. In those days I gravitated towards the sea. I loved to dart around the rock pools, examining the animal life that was so diverse and intriguing. I would find sea anemones, brown seaweed, crabs, small fish, starfish, seagrass, sponges, tube worms, limpets, chitrons, crabs, isopods, sea urchins, and the list goes on and on. Sometimes I found other interesting things washed to shore, like the odd glass bottle, some winter gloves, or an old battered shoe. I would lift my skirt above my knees as I paddled into the water. Sometimes a fortuitous wave would saturate me with sea spray so that my wet clothes would cling to me like soaking rags. But it was an invigorating feeling that delighted me. The fluctuating ocean had a beguiling personality all of its own that was always erratic, inconsistent, vacillating, temperamental and capricious. But one thing that was always harmonious, congruous and concordant was its marvellous ability to completely transfix me, for it was always profoundly magnificent. Sometimes the ocean was savage, fierce and wild. The truculent, untamed waves would come bounding ruthlessly towards the rock in a mighty, impetuous frenzy, spraying everything in a white, fizzy foam. I loved to watch the rise and fall of the turbulent surf, feel my own feral fury in them. Other times the sea was unusually calm, sang-froid and tranquil, the waves gentle, controlled and serene. I would find this mollifying serenity soothed my soul, like the luxurious buttery feeling of body lotion tranquilizing and pacifying an inflamed skin. Then there were times that the ocean was so still, that the sea looked like a flat piece of shimmering mirror that you could almost walk across. Growing up, I regarded the sea as my very best friend. She was my refuge, my sanctuary, my safe place where I was free to be one with myself. And, of course, the natural world. It was my quintessential escapism from a home where I wasn't noticed or even appreciated. But the ocean noticed me. She acknowledged me when I darted into the waves. I could feel the cool ocean spray skimming over my feet, or a fresh breeze nuzzling my face. I felt I could confide in her, that whatever secrets I shared with her would never be divulged to anyone else, for she was dependable, resolutely steadfast, staunchly loyal, and always there for me, with no judgment or recriminations. She would never ever betray my trust. She was the one who wiped the tears from my eyes when I realized how alone in the world I actually was, on what seemed to be like a solo journey in my own life. She was the one that brought a smile to my face when the soft shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the cobalt blue sky, dappling my face with an effusive, hugging warmth. She was the one who would wrap me in a gushing blanket of intrigue, and of course wonder, as the sun set over the peninsula in a stunning display of tangerine, orange, golds and pinks. She was the one that invigorated me in the morning, gave me a reason to climb out of my bed with an ebullient buoyancy, especially when the house was cloaked in silence, apart from the snoring sounds of my parents recovering from their nightly hangovers. Every morning I was greeted warmly by the dependable sunrise, like a reliable friend that would never let me down, smiling at me across the horizon, even if I just watched it from my bedroom window to enjoy its arresting benefits that brought a measure of reassurance and comfort to my life, the peace I hungered for so profoundly. My brother William sought clemency, solace and comfort in the books he read. He would squirrel himself away in his bedroom, reading for hours at a time, while I spent most of my time on the beach. I thoroughly enjoyed watching whales in mid-December and January through my binoculars, or in late February and May, when many of the grey whales would migrate to their summer feeding grounds. There were times I had seen bottle-nosed dolphins skimming the surf, while the seagulls I saw very regularly soared into the sky with outstretched wings, often squawking loudly, especially when they saw me around, as I often took my sandwiches to the beach. Let's just say that many of them were confiscated by a very hungry bird, and quite literally snatched out of my hands, but I did like their impertinence. My story begins when one evening my parents were passing around their cannabis that they were rolling up in cigarettes and smoking with their bohemian friends. My mother was blowing out mists of white smoke from her pursed, puckered lips in the living room, seated in a circle, with her legs crossed on a large Moroccan colourful cushion, on the carpeted floor, next to both of her friends. My mother looked up at me through her bleary, intoxicated blue eyes that were so often bloodshot, in the sunken hollows of her pale, rather wilted-looking face. "Why don't you come and join us, love? How about a puff?" My mother was eager for us to engage in her lifestyle choices, which we shunned. I wrinkled up my nose in disgust. "No, I'm fine, Mum, thank you very much." My mother giggled. "She's so prim and proper, my daughter. A goody two-shoes," she said, giggling. My mother was a fragile, thin, wafer-like woman who looked like she could be blown over by a heavy wind. Unfortunately, it was her lifestyle that had emaciated her so badly, robbing her of the feminine curves that had once made her a pretty woman. But she wasn't attractive now. She was like an old rose dying in a vase, the petals on the edge becoming brown and frayed, the bud beginning to dry out, for she wasn't a picture of a glowing, healthy woman at all. She looked older than her 40 years, as her substance abuse had sucked out her health like a ravenous, blood-sucking leech, while the treacherous telltale signs of aging were pronounced and very prominent around her mouth and eye areas. Her delicate white skin looked like fine paper covering a skull. Her blue eyes were like sunken hollows, surrounded by black moons, while her dull hair hung limply around her face. My bedraggled father was not much better. He wasn't immune to this bodily decay either. He was so underweight, looked frail and delicate, like a sickly man in his 80s, when he was only 41 years old at the time. "Go on, love. How about a puff? It'll do you good. You're so wound up." "I told you, Mum, I'm absolutely fine," I said, sighing with exasperation. "I think I'm going down to the beach." "She's going to the beach," said my mother, as if I'd said something terribly funny. "She's going to the beach," repeated my father, and everyone laughed. Then they did what they always did remarkably well. They simply ignored me. My brother was tucked away in his bedroom. "Fancy coming for a walk with me, Clark?" I asked him. My brother Clark was a handsome boy with blue eyes, a mop of blonde hair. His skin was fair, but if he spent any time in the sun, which was almost never, his skin would become golden. My brother always got straight A's at school and distinctions for English, as he was a consummate reader. We had an incredible friendship, for in our household it was us against the world, a united team, so we were incredibly close. But while my brother appreciated the beauty of the sea views from our home, he barely ever engaged in outdoor pursuits. He looked up at me from a book. "Sorry, sis, I've got to a very exciting part in my book. The woman has just been murdered. There are 3 suspects, but my money's on the cook. She's as guilty as hell. I think she put some poison in the food." And he was about to continue, but I found it so boring listening to him droning on about the book he was reading. My brother was big on stories involving murder and steeped in mystery. "Enjoy," I said, not wanting to listen to him any further. I don't know why I ever asked him to join me for a walk. He rarely ever agreed to accompany me to the beach. Presumably he was addicted to his books, as much as I was to the ocean. As was always the case, I could feel my heart lifting as I trotted down the sweeping steel staircase towards the beach, with a little lantern in my hands. I smiled happily to myself as I breathed in the fragrant, fresh, crisp air, tasting its saltiness on my tongue. It was a glorious night. The soft shafts of moonlight caressed the blue ocean in a shimmering ethereal light that twinkled across the water in a silvery sheen. I could hear the crashing sound of the feisty waves thrashing against the rocks, pounding them with a forceful appreciation. There was a soft breeze blowing. Some of the trees that fringed the edges of the coastal sand were swinging their boughs in the wind as though they were dancing. I could hear the reassuring sound of the crickets and frogs serenading the night with their pleasing chorus. I ran towards the water, my feet anointed by the cooling spray of the surf. I walked along the edges of the water, watching my footprints being filled with water as the waves swept forwards and backwards. I picked up a few shells, skimming them across the water, something I always enjoyed doing. All of a sudden I got the peculiar feeling that I was being watched, which was rather odd, as this was our family private beach, so no one should be here. It was rather rare to get a stranger loitering around the beach. But to be fair, it had happened a couple of times. On one occasion a group of teenage girls had camped out on our beach, but we had turned a blind eye to the trespassers. Another time a drunken vagrant had been seen walking across the sand. The very next day his deceased body was discovered washed to shore, but that's a whole nother story. On this beautiful evening, under the canopy of a pretty night sky, bespeckled by clusters of silvery stars and an ivory moon that caressed the sky in a generous, delicate light, I couldn't shake off that feeling that something or someone was staring at me. That was when I saw something separating itself from the rock. At first I thought it was the rock, until it isolated itself from the structure. Whatever it was appeared to be gliding towards me very gracefully, swinging its arms and legs as it neared its approach, until it stopped only yards away from where I was standing. That was when I saw him. But what was he? He looked human, only he was covered from top to toe with long flowing dark brown hair. He was about 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, with a densely muscular body and a very human-looking face. My heart began to race, for he was so beautiful. I found my blue eyes being locked into his golden brown gaze. He had the most exquisite eyes I've ever seen. It was like an instant, powerful attraction, of which I cannot describe. My heart began to flutter with butterflies. I felt tingles ascending and descending up and down my spine. I had never felt this euphoric floating feeling before. I had heard all about it in romantic movies, of course, but I had never experienced something like this for myself. I know the creature felt it too. It was a feeling like nothing else I have ever experienced in my entire life. A magnetic, electric, palpable, physical attraction over which I had no control. I had a longing to reach out and touch him, to run my hands through his silky hair. The creature sat down on the soft beach sand. I automatically sat down next to him, sinking blissfully into the soft sea sand, allowing the silken granules to exfoliate my feet. We both sat there staring at the ocean, saying nothing, until the creature grunted approvingly. I whispered back to him, "Yes, it is so beautiful, rarely beautiful. It's the only place in the entire world I feel safe." The creature turned around to look directly at me, as if he comprehended exactly what I was saying. He then nodded. Once again our eyes were locked into each other's. I felt enveloped by his warmth and humour. His eyes twinkled at me mischievously. I assertively put my hand on his knee. I stroked his leg. That was when he took my hand in his. We both laughed, for my hand was dwarfed by his. He took my palm and examined every finger and nail. Then he put my hand on the edge of his mouth and began to nibble it gently and tenderly, all the while looking at me with adoring eyes that made my heart melt like butter. I knew if he wanted me, I was all his, for I could feel myself surrendering to him, like the rocks surrender to the ocean spray, for they cannot stop what nature has inspired. The nerve endings in my body began to tingle as he touched me. He then licked my hand like a popsicle, which made me giggle. It was my turn to examine his hand. I took his hand in mine affectionately, playing with all his fingers one by one. Each one of his fingers was like a pork sausage in its size, with a flat nail bed. His hands felt warm and strong, and holding them in mine made me feel connected to him. It was like I never wanted to release my grip. We sat there watching the ocean together, my head resting against his shoulders, while his long arm tenderly stroked the sides of my arms. It didn't feel like I was in the presence of an animal at all, but in the presence of a virile masculine man, built like a Greek god, covered by hair. A human with remarkable intelligence, incredible charm, undeniable attractiveness that had completely seduced my heart. Even when we parted company for that evening, we both knew we would see each other the following night, for there was a fire that had started between us, a fire that could not be put out or tamed. I remember skipping back home that night, knocking on my brother's bedroom door. "Clark, Clark, are you awake?" He was sitting up in bed, still reading, completely gripped by his story, and was momentarily annoyed by my interruption. "What's up, sis?" he asked, frowning. "You look rather pleased with yourself. You're positively glowing, in fact. What's happened?" "I've met someone," I told him. "I think I'm in love. I've never felt this way before about anyone." "Really?" said my brother. "What does it feel like to be in love? I've read about it in books, but I've never experienced it for myself." "Electric tingles all over my body, like I'm drawn to touch him all over, that I have a desperate need to be with him all the time. But I have to restrain myself. Women aren't supposed to be physically assertive or direct, are they? But I have this insatiable magnetism for him. I've never felt this way before about anyone. It's like the addiction our parents have with drugs. It's like I can't help myself." "You've got it bad. Who is he? Where did you meet him?" "On the beach. He's so handsome, but completely different to your average man. Exceedingly different." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, he's 7 foot tall. For a start, he's covered in hair, but he's definitely still human." "Sis, is this one of your weird, warped jokes? Because if it is, I'm not laughing." "No, I'm being serious," I told my brother. And so began the most unlikely relationship, an inspiring, galvanizing love story between me and an anomalous creature called Onokona, which he told me means white owl. I only learnt later on in life that Onokona was a Bigfoot, but to me he was the quintessential love of my life. He was the man of my dreams. For in my eyes he was no different to any other man physically, with the exception of being a gentle giant covered with hair, with an undeniable wisdom, discernible intuition, incredible inquisitiveness, and awe-inspiring emotional intelligence. From the moment I met him, there was an electrifying, gripping passion that stirred between the two of us like a huge wind blowing over the Atlantic, with a feisty speed that could not be quashed. With Onokona, I found an immaculate, blameless, untamed love that was non-judgmental, unconditionally sincere, beautifully unspoilt, pristine, like nothing I'd ever known in my life. It was like graduating from eating bland food all your life and then eating a delectable mouth-watering meal, more delicious than anything you've ever tasted before. You cannot forget those vibrant new flavours that override the positively inferior. I had longed to be loved, with a pure, untainted love like this, an unselfish, enduring love, as acceptance, approval, and validation from my only family was never forthcoming. For no one in my life had ever loved me like he did, for his love was passionate, deep, unfeigned, generous, sincere, tender, and ever so gentle. I loved to hold his huge hand, or rest my head against his powerful gargantuan shoulders. He would run his hands affectionately through my long blonde hair. He would even braid it from time to time. There were times he would envelop me in his overlong, substantial arms, holding me so close to him for ages, as if he never ever wanted to let me go. He made me feel like the most treasured, valuable thing in his entire life. He smelt like the ocean. I could always detect the salt in his hair. He was so mighty, so titanically big. I felt tiny when I rested my head upon his chest. I could hear the rhythmic beating of his heart, the rise and fall of his chest. We would sit on the soft sea sand together, entwined in each other's arms, watching the waves gliding across the sand, or beating against the rock with a vigorous white spray. We appreciated watching the sun setting over the peninsula. It was all so transfixing. It was nirvana. Onokona would say Ozda, which means very good. He spoke an audible language, but although I could not comprehend the words, that was not significant, for the communication between us was better than words. He knew the thoughts in my head, the workings of my mind, like a car engineer might understand the mechanics of that perplexing aluminium carcass. Onokona often spoke to me in my mind. I grew to communicate with him telepathically, which means you don't have to use your mouth at all. The words he whispered into my mind like a cool, invigorating breeze, or a soft flowing brook, as they were easily discernible and very perceptible. Sometimes he would put me on his shoulders. Running through the surf, we would get completely soaked. I'd kill myself laughing, tugging and pulling at his hair, nearly falling over in my rapturous delight as I laughed so much. But he always clasped me tightly, mindfully aware that I was not as agile and resilient as he was. Onokona loved it when I laughed. He began to imitate my laughter. There were many things I did that he affectionately imitated, as that was one of the ways he expressed his love towards me. Sometimes his imitations were so hilariously funny that I would laugh so deep down in my belly that it would tug and pull at my muscles because I'd never laughed that much before. So much so it physically hurt, as if my internal muscles were physically working out at a gym. Onokona could imitate songbirds, seagulls, dogs, cats, and so much more. He could whistle like a pro. He found it inconceivable that I couldn't whistle. He tried to teach me, but his assiduous efforts failed in vain, for try as I might, I couldn't whistle at all. We would explore the rock pools together, examine the ocean creatures. Sometimes we would gather shells, some that I still own today, for he collected many for me. We would place them against our ears to hear the ocean. I would often bring picnic baskets to the beach for us. Onokona absolutely adored bacon and maple syrup on brown bread. He adored apple crumb cake, and he loved appetizer. Our love was hot and passionate, but Onokona was a gentle, attentive lover who would make other physical expressions of love seem clumsy and chaotic, but his love was seamless. On multiple occasions I fell pregnant. I would be deliriously happy. The two of us would rejoice in the fruit of our love yet to be born. He would rub his hand gleefully over my stomach, as if anticipating the patter of little feet in the future. If my parents had known about my pregnancy, they wouldn't have even batted an eyelid. Unfortunately, my pregnancies never went beyond the first trimester, as I would miscarry over and over and over again. I would awaken to find a pool of scarlet red blood pouring down my legs. It broke my heart. I wanted to carry his baby, but my body was not willing to accept the pregnancy. I was to learn later on in life that this was because I was a rhesus A negative blood type, so my body naturally fought against a fetus of a different blood type, perceiving the growing baby in my womb to be a potential threat to my health. Nowadays, a simple injection in the bum will rectify that problem so that a mother can carry her baby to full term with relative ease and no complications. I think Onakona was much more grief-stricken than I was about my miscarriages, for if we could sire a child together, his mother would invite me to live among his kind, as the introduction of a baby would automatically change everything for us, for his mother's heart would then be persuaded to accept me. Onakona tried to keep our relationship secret from his mother, for he knew if she found out about us, she would definitely destroy our relationship. He told me that he had one sister and a very docile father, but a mother who ruled the roost in their family with an iron fist that could not be challenged. It was her way or the highway. Even his father, who was twice her size, was overawed and intimidated by her. It would seem his mother had a pretty dim view of humans, and 3 members of her family had wantonly been shot dead by humans in the past, so a festering anger burnt away in her heart against our kind, for she saw humans as atrociously treacherous, completely ungainly, untrustworthy. Our kind were positively inferior, but we saw ourselves as superior to her kind, deceptively thinking that because we had mastered the use of a gun or a crossbow, that we could conquer everything and anything. But our fallacious abilities were ingeniously limited, callow and unsophisticated, as most humans could not mind read, were not telepathic, very clumsy on foot, with inadequate, rudimentary, fragile bodies that could so easily break and were susceptible to death. Our kind had no comprehension about other dimensions and the infinite universe, as well as the fact that our imperishable, immortal soul lives on forever and is abiding, can never be distinguished even beyond death. But many of us perceive death to be a finality, a complete end of us. Indeed, Onakona's mother would be absolutely furious if she were to find him interacting with a human woman. She would see that as the ultimate form of duplicitous betrayal. Indeed, that would be exceedingly disappointing to her. She had already selected another female for him to sire children with, whom she had proudly, assertively handpicked to become the mother of her grandchildren, but he felt no charismatic attraction or chemistry towards her. His people are no different to us. They have morals, values, specific tastes, likes and dislikes. Onakona's acquired taste was for me. Mine was for him. We wanted each other. We wanted to be together forever. He was the water that could quench my thirst, the food that could satisfy my hunger. He was my everything, and I loved him with all my heart. It would seem he argued tirelessly with his mother. He wanted nothing to do with the female that she had selected for him. His mother was punctilious, audaciously resolute, determined that she was the one to choose his lifelong partner. She believed this female would produce good stock for her family line. She was very well built as a female, with powerful childbearing hips. Her family lineage had sired more children than the average Bigfoot family, which was considered a huge bonus. Onakona told me that there were other species of his kind, some benevolent, very human-like, while others that beheld faces more of a primate. Those were the ones inclined to greater violence, but most of his kind were peace-loving, very intelligent beings. One day me and Onakona were to find that our love would be ripped apart from us when we were walking along the beach together, hand in hand, gazing lovingly into each other's eyes. Then we saw her. His mother came gliding towards us. Our cover had been blown. Our secret was out. Onakona's mother was tall and lanky, with huge hips and oversized, full, pillowy breasts. Her anger was all-consuming, like a dark storm cloud brewing over the horizon. She was like the lightning flashing across the sky, inflamed by an untamed, contemptuous fury. She stared at me through dark treacle eyes that were hostile and irate. She stood next to her son, talking to him in a stern, incensed tone of voice. They spoke together, arguing backwards and forwards over and over again. Onakona tried to fight for our love with all his might, as if his life depended on it. But his mother was unyielding and uncompromising, like a solid brick wall. She saw Onakona's interaction with me as the ultimate betrayal, for he had condoned what humans had done to her family line by cavorting with the likes of me. Onakona told her to forgive, to let it go, not to tarnish all humans with the same brush. But Onakona's mother could not forgive the memories of what humans had done to her people. They were seared in her mind like an indelible tattoo that could not be shifted. She told Onakona to say his goodbyes to me, for if he did not, she would take matters into her own hands. She stood there on the sea sand, impatiently waiting, like a tall, imposing tree, penciling up into the sky. Onakona stared lovingly into my eyes as we embraced. He held my hand in his. "I need to go," he told me. "We can be no more in this lifetime, for if I betray my mother, she will surely kill you. But you are mine forever. When you watch the sun rise over the valley or set on the peninsula, know that I am always with you, that you are wrapped in my love. When you watch the ocean waves crashing against the rocks, you see the white foaming spray. My love is in that spray. For wherever you are, my love will remain with you always. For you are mine forever, and I am yours. When you think of me during the day, it is no accident. It is me affirming my precious love to you. For even if we cannot be together in this lifetime, I will do everything to ensure that we will be together again in every lifetime." I cried as I clung to Onakona's body, the salty tears pouring down my face, the ache in my heart so unbearable that I felt as if every breath had been squeezed out of me. For my heart was broken, for without him I was incomplete. "No, no, please don't go." He turned around, with his mother glancing over his shoulders, his eyes filled with grievous sorrow. And then he was gone. I never saw Onakona again. He was my true love. I could never commit or pledge my love to another man after that. So I have lived exclusively alone all my life. But the memories of Onakona and our rare unorthodox exclusive love is what still gives me a skip to my step and an inspiring hope in my heart. For I know one day, when I breathe my very last, I will be reunited with my one true love. It is true that every time I see the sun set, or the sun rise, or the ocean spray, I see the heart of my beloved. Not a day goes by that he doesn't whisper into my mind to send me his love. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.